Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a big approach. Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Oh, welcome to this podcast review for October 21st, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation. I'm very excited that we are joined by the woman of the hour, Megan Kearns from Spoilerpiece Theater is back. Welcome, Megan, to the show.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me back.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great to have you here. I believe this is the first time you've been here with Brendan here as well.
I was just going to say for the three of
us,
us, because I think the last time you were on, Megan, it was just you and JD, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
that's correct.
I believe that is correct. So it is exciting to have you here and Brendan here collectively. And it's
What
great
movie
to
was
have,
that you guys talked about?
was it Magic Mike? The third Magic Mike?
We
Was that
did.
the last time?
We talked about something else too, though.
There was another one. Yeah, there was
Yeah.
another one.
That's
I
how you
can't
know
really
you've been
recall.
podcasting for too long when you can't even
When you
recall
can't
that
remember.
type of archive.
Yeah. There was definitely another one
Yes.
in between.
Yes.
Yeah.
A better
you know,
film.
it all
Didn't
blurs
mean to put you both on the
together,
spot
especially
with
at
that
my age.
spontaneous question. I was just
I
genuinely
know, right?
curious.
Yeah, we've had Megan on a couple of times. Always love being here.
Oh,
And
thank you.
you were also on Women in Session or Chasing the
Yes.
Gold. I can't remember. Women in Session. Okay, yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So that's also very exciting. You're just making the rounds here, which is very exciting.
Would you
Sometimes
like a
you're
job?
here, sometimes you're upstairs.
I
You know,
would.
you're welcome at the In Session Film House, wherever.
Thank you. I love it. I feel so welcome.
That's great to
You should.
hear. So, yeah, we're here to talk about Anna Kendrick's directorial debut, Woman of the Hour. This premiered at Toronto last year in 2023, but it, of course, releases on Netflix this last weekend. I got to ask you guys, were you familiar with this story at all? It is based on the real serial killer that showed up on the dating game in 1978. Were you familiar with the story, the film itself? Because I'll be honest, I love Anna Kendrick. I didn't really know too much about this film going into it. It wasn't on my radar much at the beginning of the year until recently. And now I checked out some of the reviews from Toronto last year. That certainly piqued my interest. And I love Anna Kendrick in general. So
Oh, yeah.
the idea of her getting behind the camera certainly is exciting. So I'm curious where your guys' mind space was coming into this. Megan,
Megan, you go first. You're the woman of the hour.
Thank you. I know that's such an honor. I heard about this after it premiered at Toronto, so it was on my radar, but I didn't really know much about the actual true story. And it feels weird to say that because I used to watch old episodes of The Dating Game from the 70s, like on the Game Show Network or one of those channels a long time ago. And I know this episode has never aired, or I shouldn't say never, but it's not available. Like only fragments of it are available online. So that's probably why I never saw it. But I was not familiar with this story. So it was very surprising to hear about a serial killer who was a contestant on The Dating Game. It was a very unique hook.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I was maybe familiar with the idea of it as if it was some type of legend that maybe circulated the history of the show, but I didn't really know the factual nature of it. And we'll certainly talk about the history as depicted in Anna Kendrick's movie, because not all of it is quote unquote historically accurate. There's a few
Right.
things it takes liberties on, as you would expect for a movie like this.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
I think I was at least familiar with the almost like the urban legend of it all and whether it was true or not. But like you, Megan, I was at least familiar with the dating game itself because many celebrities actually appeared on the dating game back in the day. Sally Field is one of the most notable examples, and that is true, as
which
the
they
movie does
mentioned,
reference. Who else was actually on? I think so. Wasn't Steve Martin on the dating game at one point in his life before he actually made it big? I think there. I think there was. I may have to fact check
I feel
myself
like I
on
want to
that one.
Google that now.
I know, right?
No idea.
Google that. See if you can find an image of Steve Martin on the dating game, because I could have sworn that could have been the case, which is basically me going down a tangent that has nothing to do with the question you brought up, Judy. So I apologize. But yeah, long story short, not too familiar with this story, but I feel like I've heard rumblings of it like it was some type of urban legend, which is what piqued my interest about the movie, given how it does sit within a possible historical landscape. I think it seemed really interesting.
Yeah, I wasn't all that familiar with this, as I noted, and I don't know what it says about our society when you hear that they're basing this film off of a serial killer from the 70s, and your immediate thought is, which one? There's too many.
There's too many.
So many.
Disturbing, but true.
so disturbing. And so you immediately look it up, and it's Rodney Alcala. Is that how you say his name? I'm not even sure, to be perfectly honest with you. And I wasn't too familiar with Rodney's story. And that also piqued my interest, I guess, a little bit further, because this was going to be refreshing. The idea that he was able to get on this show is certainly an irony that I'm sure we'll talk about. So yeah, that very much had me hooked. I completely agree with you guys there. And Anna Kendrick behind the camera, in front of the camera, I was ready. I was ready for it.
That's something that always interests me, regardless if the movie ends up being good or not, is when a well-known actor steps behind the camera for the first time. Because I'm always curious what, in many cases, it might not always be successful, but many actors, when they find themselves directing for the first time, they usually bring kind of a new discipline that we haven't seen before. And I always find that interesting to see what kind of new things they might have, because their lens is very much like they're used to being in a different headspace when it comes to making movies. And I guess we'll get into it further, but Anna Kendrick does do some very interesting things here that I'm sure we'll talk about.
Absolutely. And, the other thing too, because I completely agree with that, Brennan, the other thing that I think maybe, unless I'm mistaken here, but from the little research I did, the other thing that excited me, despite this appearing on Netflix, is that it wasn't like made by Netflix. It was simply bought by Netflix. Excuse me. Bought by Netflix after it premiered at TIFF. So, and we've talked about this 100 times on the show, but there is a very, very huge difference between Netflix movies and movies that just appear on Netflix.
Yeah. There are your Romas of the world, then there's your Red Notices of the world.
Exactly. Huge difference. Huge difference. So I was excited that this was more in the Roma camp than the Red Notice camp. So that coupled with, the intrigue that you're talking about there, Brendan, certainly held my interest for sure. So
yeah.
I was excited. Plus, all the early buzz was quite positive. So, with that said, I guess we can go ahead and jump into this. Maybe at a certain point, slight spoilers. Obviously, so much of this is based off the real life event. As Brennan noted, it does take liberties, but I think as we get into this, there might be some factoids about the case and Rodney and who he was that the film reveals to us that from a film perspective might come off spoilery, but it's history. So I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, fair point.
As we get into this. Okay. With that said, Woman of the Hour, it is directed by Anna Kendrick, and you'll never believe this, but it stars Anna Kendrick.
No.
I know. Who would have thought?
I'm shocked.
As well as Daniel Zavato, Nicolette Robinson, Tony Hale, and others that come and go throughout the film, including Pete Holmes with a small little role here as well. If you're not familiar with Woman of the Hour, Cheryl Bradshaw, a single woman looking for a suitor on a hit 1970s TV show. I think we all know which one they're alluding to there. Chooses, like in the synopsis, I clearly did not read this before jumping in here.
I love when
just
you
go
don't.
ahead and tells us. Like it just tells us what happens. Just tells us who she chooses. Like I noted, it's history. So I wasn't
Yeah,
even
if
planning
this weren't history, it would be the biggest Spark Notes example of a Wikipedia page, essentially.
I just love
It's like
that.
it's like if you could Spark Note a Spark Note is basically how that plot synopsis kind of reads.
Yeah, that is really funny. I did not intentionally weave those two things together that we were going to give away some things because it is history. And it turns out the
IMDb
synopsis
did it for
just
you.
gives it away. At any rate, I'll just say Rodney is involved in the TV show as we stated, and unaware he is behind a lot of deadly violence happening in the area.
He's a bad guy.
He's a bad guy. Bad guy, as we all know. All right, let's jump into this. We'll start with you, Megan. What did you think about Woman of the Hour?
I thought this was great. I really appreciated the way it centers victims in this, which is not always the case in the true crime genre. I love that it weaves back and forth in time, that we see the various victims and their snippets of their lives, as well as Cheryl's, who's kind of anchoring the whole story. I love Anna Kendrick's performance. I think it's really good. I think it taps into her very quippy banter and her way of fast speaking and her comedic style, while still being very grounded and tense, and showing her reaction to Rodney's really sinister, creepy, increasingly growing misogynist and predatory behavior. I liked the supporting performances. Daniel Zavato as Rodney, Tony Hale, who's such a creep in this too. I really appreciated that we see the different levels of sexism and misogyny, whether it's Cheryl's audition where they're telling her about being nude and like, oh, you're okay with that, right? And she's like, no, actually, I'm not. And then they're like, oh, I'm sure it's fine.
It's kind of a funny scene, which I didn't expect that. Yeah.
Yeah. But what's so disturbing about it too is Anna Kendrick said in an interview with Vogue that was taken from a direct conversation she had with a casting agent when she was 19. And so it's like
weirdly
so gross.
Not even weirdly, just it does not surprise me at all.
Right, exactly. But it's so disturbing how it fits so perfectly into the 70s as well as today.
Sure.
But yeah, I really, there's so much to love here. I think it's a really sharply, smartly directed film. I think it's well written. I think the cast is great. I think it's an unusual true crime film in that, like Anna Kendrick said, she wanted to stay away from kind of salacious violence because that she didn't want it to be exploitative, and that doesn't really interest her. And I think that is what's really different about this. And not that all true crime is salacious, because it's not, but there is something that feels very different about this in a way that's more subtle and yet more sinister in a way. And I just really appreciated that about this film.
Yeah, there's a word you use there that I think best sums up this movie, and that's unusual. There are a lot of unusual qualities to this when compared to other crime movies, whether they be true crime or somehow indirectly related to some real life crime in some way. Because this is a very unusual depiction of not just this story, but true crime in general. And that even comes down to the narrative flow of the film, as you were alluding to, which admittedly is something I'm still scratching my head over, because it does kind of have a weird structure to it. And maybe as we talk about it further, I'll, really see what Anna Kendrick was deliberately trying to do, interweaving all of these different things together. It doesn't really follow a traditional like 3-act structure as many movies do. It doesn't even feel like it really has a clear beginning, middle, and end. You would go into this movie thinking, okay, the centerpiece here is going to be this dating game show, which in a way it kind of is the centerpiece, but it doesn't really feel like one. It kind of just feels like maybe the primary detour of Rod's crimes in a way. But there's obviously more to it than that. But it's a very unusual film that I really did find very interesting. And I think Anna Kendrick is doing a lot of really interesting things, not just interweaving these different subplots, if you will, together, but the way she depicts it, like you're saying, Megan, feels weirdly sadistic, but also kind of like cautious at the same time.
Yes.
So it actually does a great job like finding this balance between thrilling but not being too gratuitous, which is a really hard thing to do because there are some very sinister things here, and a lot of it does come from Daniel Zavada's performance, which is very chilling, as we'll talk about further. There's even a lot regarding his performance and how it relates to the sea of misogyny as depicted in this movie that I want to talk about further,
Yes.
which in
Mhm.
any other film, in any other filmmaker's hands that didn't quite have a grasp on this material, this could have easily just turned into another message movie. And this one does have that, but it does it in a way that I think is pretty delicate and interesting. And I do want to get into those ideas a little bit further. But I thought there was a very surprising sophistication here, especially from a first-time filmmaker. And I think Anna Kendrick does a really interesting job here. And I really want to see what she does next.
Yep, I'm with you guys. I really liked this a lot. I think Anna Kendrick directs the hell out of it. It is visually quite compelling. The framing and blocking is extraordinary, way beyond my expectations for it. But it is very clear she has an eye for photography.
Yeah.
That is evident from the opening frame of the film. Similarly, the production design is excellent. Perhaps most notably, though, the film is vividly tense in the horror it displays as a thriller. It wonderfully delivers with tone and creating suspense with a character that uses charm as a weapon. And I think that's honestly where it thrives the most. Kendrick does not hold back with the film's commentary on misogyny, starting, of course, with Alcala and his overt violence. Yet the film isn't just angry at his crimes, but equally the apathy of law enforcement that allowed it to happen, as he had been reported to the police several times over the span of a decade, all without consequence, despite evidence and even brutal testimony from a few survivors. And if that isn't enough, it's all caked in that irony we mentioned earlier that he was allowed to not just be on, but win an episode of the dating game where that weaponized charm is in full effect. Kendrick goes out of her way to demonstrate this clear divide, as you guys are talking about, between the men that work on the show versus the women who do what they can to help Cheryl as if she was preparing to see action in the next Hunger Games. It isn't all that subtle.
Yeah.
But
Great analogy.
thank you. It might not be subtle, but that works when there's conviction to the filmmaking. And boy, is there a lot of conviction here. I love how she fights fire with fire, so to speak. Cinematically, I found that extremely engaging here. Certainly helps when Daniel Zavada comes in with one of the most chilling performances of the year. I completely agree with you guys there as well.
Yeah, he's really good.
I was quite stunned by how good this is. I loved it, and I'm with you, Brendan. I echo everything you said as far as Kendrick and what her directorial career could look like. I'm very excited to see what she has up her sleeve next.
Absolutely. And there's something you said there, Jaden, and I'll bounce it back over to you, Megan, that I think is really crucial for this film working. And it's really a testament to a movie getting away with this. This movie is not very subtle. And I kind of appreciated that. Like, I think like weirdly, a movie that isn't very subtle like that could be very room for very direct criticism, but somehow that lack of subtlety makes Rodney all the more chilling because it doesn't just showcase how he's how conniving he is, that he's able to use his charm as a weapon, like both of you are saying, but the fact that he's aware that this misogyny exists and that's something he can now take advantage of. Like that's how this movie is able to get away with that notion so well and make Rodney even more chilling. And I feel like in any other film, it would just seem kind of repetitive in a way. But here, it actually has a very clear thematic purpose. And I really responded to that. I think that makes him all the more chilling and actually adds a layer of nuance to this movie that otherwise might not have been there in a lesser director's hands. I thought it was great.
Yeah, I agree about actually so much of what you're saying. The Daniel Zavato's performance, I think it's really fascinating if you compare it with his performance in Station 11, the TV series, because
Okay.
he's playing a kind of chilling character in that too, but also charming and has some complexities. And that performance is what led Anna Kendrick to want him for that role as
Oh, I did not
Rodney.
know that. Okay.
Yeah, which I think
Yeah,
is
I
so
didn't know that either. That's
fascinating.
fascinating.
Yeah,
Okay.
because when I'm watching this, I had seen Station 11, and then I read the press notes which included an interview with her talking about like the casting and her direction, and she said that, and I was like, yeah, and it feels like such a companion piece, those two performances, but
Mhm.
this one
Mhm.
is much more intense in its malevolence and in
Mhm.
its dread than that performance in that show. But yeah, I think something else that's really fascinating about this film is, and I feel like not that there are not men who can't understand this, because they certainly can, but I
Mhm.
think when you have a woman director, and especially one who is as smart as Anna Kendrick, what she's also really tapping into here is the politeness that women have to navigate in order to be safe, in order
Mhm.
to remain safe. Because throughout the film, we see women, like we see the last girl, the runaway girl, when she's like, "Oh, can we just keep this between us?" And she's
Mhm.
trying to use that to disarm him and to earn his trust so she can, try to keep herself safe. And Cheryl's doing the same thing by giving her phone number. And
Mhm.
with
Mhm.
all the men she interacts with, she's really trying to keep herself diminished in order to not piss them off and upset them.
Yep.
And Laura does the same thing when she's trying to go to the police, until
Yeah.
she, freaks out, rightfully so, and screams, "Do your fucking job."
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
even she throughout is also trying to be very nice, very, appeasing. And so I think that that's something that really this film taps into, is how women, when they navigate the world with men, they often have to be uber polite and extra nice in order to remain safe, which is
Yeah.
just, oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
it captures that
Yeah.
experience so
No,
exquisitely.
Yeah.
I
Yeah. Very
completely agree
cryptic
that.
power in a way.
Yeah, that was one of the key takeaways for me as well,
Mhm.
is that idea of women having to put on some sort of uncomfortable but cordial face as a
Yes.
way of navigating the potential threat in front of them. And you threw out some really great examples. I immediately thought of that moment with Charlie in New York City where she felt obligated to share a beer with Rodney after he helped her move her
Yes.
stuff into the apartment, which
Mhm.
is immediately fine. You understand that until the
Yeah.
moment comes where she clearly wants him to leave so she can begin unpacking and begin
Yeah.
her life there, but it gets weird quickly.
Yeah.
Or pretty
Yeah.
much any moment with Cheryl and Ed Burke in this film, whose behavior is outwardly appalling, and she just
Mhm.
has to act like it's okay. Just has to act like it's normal. Or on
Yeah.
the other end of that spectrum, Terry, played by Pete Holmes here, might have noble intentions, but it's clear he wants something from her, and she has to kindly find a way to say no, which then changes his entire attitude toward her immediately.
Mhm.
Mhm.
But
Yep.
Mhm.
and perhaps most striking, I completely agree with you, Megan. It is Amy and that smile, that laugh that she has there with that encounter, just has to completely brush that off despite being beaten and raped. It is a devastating moment in this film. It is incredible
Mhm.
how Kendrick uses awkward tension, something that on its face could just be a weird moment between two people, as a way to invoke real horror for these characters.
Mhm.
Again, how all of that is evoked through that weaponized charm from Rodney for sure, but it brings to the surface this true terror that these characters have to face,
Yeah.
and having that facade of niceness kind of lead to that horror. It is that
Yes.
it
That's
was striking
yeah.
to see that here.
That's
Absolutely
why
striking.
that's why I used the word cryptic there just a few moments ago. It's almost like the best way to get to get away from these men is to make them seem like they have even more power in the moment. It's like this psychological toying of sorts. And that's what makes them let their guard down, is when they feel like they are able to get away with it. And that's what makes this movie really psychologically stirring, and why it's able to really take advantage of the fact that this is literally a sea of misogyny, as I called it earlier, which is a weird way of saying it, but
No, but it's true.
but nearly, not even nearly, pretty much every male character in this movie has. I say nearly because there's at least one that's we don't get to know him enough to really justify any opinions on him, and that's the Laura character's, I guess, husband or boyfriend. The people in the audience, we don't really know much about them, but outside of that, it's a dangerous world that this movie depicts, and I think it gets away with it in a really interesting way because of what both of y'all are talking about, and I found that really effective.
I have to say, Laura's boyfriend / husband, I'm not sure what he is too. I think he's such a jerk though, because he doesn't believe her.
Yeah.
And
He doesn't, yeah.
Even he comes around and he's like nicer, but even he is like not believing of
He's
her,
just
which is so
he's just such
frustrating.
he's not enough of a character for at least me to have like an opinion
Very
on him
true.
yet, which is the thing. It's more of it, but I guess I think that's kind of a deliberate point on Anna Kendrick's part, is to keep a character like that a bit more undiscernible, I guess, which I think adds more nuance to this whole conversation as we're having here.
Very true.
He's the only one that has any sort of self-awareness of his behavior, though.
Yeah.
Yes, that's
Because
true.
Maybe some type
agree
of
with
arc
you.
by the end.
He
Yeah.
doesn't believe her. He does come off antagonistic in that moment, playing
For
into
sure.
the film's themes. But there is that visual at the end of the film where he seemingly is apologetic.
Sure.
You're right, Brendan. We don't get too much beyond the visual, but
Right.
it does at the very least indicate that he might have been aware of his behavior, but he is the only one. There is no other male figure here with any sort of self-awareness at all.
Exactly.
And another interesting insight into this film, and this is a fascinating contradiction to what we were talking about earlier, and how this film lacks subtlety, which I say complimentary. I love that about this
that's
film.
what makes it work.
But there are subtle filmmaking things that Kendrick employs here that I really do love. And one of them is the way she emphasizes eyes on the characters. And while we certainly get that with Rodney as well, I think of that opening scene in particular, there is an emphasis on his eyes and how he's able to shift from that weaponized charm to maniacal violence in an instant. However, because so much of this is ciphered through our female characters here, there are two moments in this film that really stand out to me as far as these characters having an exchange where something is understood, or at least attempting to be conveyed, without any sort of conventional dialogue between those two characters. So one of those moments is Laura as they're filming the game show, right? And I believe, Megan, you brought this up earlier, where she has a visceral reaction when she sees Rodney there on stage. She is convinced that this is the man who killed her friend the year before. She gets up to leave, accidentally knocks over a monitor. During the commotion, there is a medium shot on Laura looking back at Cheryl. Cheryl looking back at Laura as well. So they do lock eyes there, but there is this blinding light that prevents that message from being conveyed to Laura, being conveyed to Cheryl, excuse me. But you absolutely see the attempt there in Laura. She is trying to, with every might in her facial tick, express to Laura that she is in danger. Or to Cheryl, excuse me. I'm confusing the names there. But my point in there is to say that there is an attempt to convey a message that Cheryl is in danger.
It visualizes it like a telepathic kind of way.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then I also think of, and again, this is maybe some slight spoilers here, but I think it's necessary for this conversation. There is the date scene near the end of the film between Rodney and
I figure you're going to reference
Cheryl.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought that
And
too.
Rodney tries to order a second round of drinks, and there's a brilliant shot. It's an incredible shot, and it is very subtle because the camera is from the waitress's point of view, looking at the two of them, and Rodney is the one closer to the frame or closer in the frame and doing the talking. So your attention might be on him, but you look at Anna Kendrick, you look at Cheryl, and the way she looks at the waitress, it is absolutely conveying, I want to get out of this as soon as possible. And the message is received, and you hear the bartender there simply utter that they're closed for the night. It is
Yeah, they
an
just missed last
absolute
call.
brilliant
Yeah.
exchange that is 100% centered on this incredible subtlety between women having an exchange, having a conversation without saying anything at all. I'm sure there's more examples that I'm missing here, but those two moments I immediately thought of
yeah.
Anna Kendrick kind of trying to sift through all the violence and the misogyny, and these women finding an understanding that, you know, as you noted, Megan, a lot of guys probably won't ever understand that level of communication because we don't need to. We've never been in that
Exactly.
position.
Right.
But women have this all the time. And so like funneling those moments the way she does here, I thought was a brilliant directorial touch.
That's why you needed someone like Anna Kendrick to direct this movie.
Yeah.
We often talk about the different gazes when it comes to making movies like this, and there's just something that Anna Kendrick as a filmmaker is able to tap into and able to visualize that I don't know if another filmmaker would have been able to do that. That sequence you're talking about there, JD, is one of my favorite shots of the year, honestly. And it's because of the framing of it. The fact that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm not mistaken, all three characters in that moment are actually all in frame in some way.
Yes.
You've got,
Yes, they are.
yeah. And it's like the cryptic nature of how Cheryl is able to decipher for a brief moment, oh, Rodney's looking away from me now. I have a clear in to signal something to this waitress.
Yeah, it's so good.
There's internal brilliance from not just a filmmaking standpoint, but from how a character tries to get out of a situation like that. It's a very intelligent use of filmmaking and visualizing how that can be done without dialogue. It's really well done.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that there is some dialogue that does kind of bolster this, though. Like when we have the second bachelor who's a wicked creep too, because he's like super objectifying of Cheryl, even though he hasn't seen her yet because he's behind the screen.
Yeah.
But even when he meets her and he's like, be careful of that guy. And then you also have the makeup artists in the studio when they're saying, you know, have fun, because the question really becomes which one of them is going to hurt you. And it's like, it's so pessimistic, but so sadly true. But I love that you have those overt moments as but it's also it's connecting these women through a camaraderie that feels not forced. It just feels very organic and very authentic in that they're trying to look out for one another. And I really love that and appreciate that about the film. And the other thing I wanted to say, JD, I love that you were talking about the opening scene because it's a brilliant scene. It's great. But also Anna Kendrick had to fight for that scene, which sounds kind of wild in the fact that she's directing and starring in this film. You'd think, you know, with someone with her clout and her fame that she wouldn't have to fight for it, but she did. And I just think that that's wild.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I guess, so I don't know if it was producers or whomever didn't want the film to start with such overt violence. And she said this in a Letterboxd interview that she compared the violence in this to the Coen brothers' No Country for Old Men. And once she said that, people were like, oh, okay. Because like that's like, you know, such a brilliant film. Sure, you can do that.
There's a lot of irony with that statement too.
Right?
Like, oh, okay, yeah, you're gonna pick a movie made by two men. Okay, yeah, that's fine. You can use that as your
Right,
influence.
now you can do it.
Yeah. It's like now you can do it. But
Yeah.
I think it's a good tone setter. I think you needed at least something
Totally.
like that to and I mean there's enough in Daniel Zavato's performance to showcase the raw fear that he's meant to project, but there's also something about his encounter with, I forget the character's name, but I know it was played by Kelly Jackal in the beginning. Sarah, I think her name was.
Yes.
Yeah, but there's something about actually seeing it firsthand in the way that it's done, which is just in a vacuum. That scene is genuinely creepy because it doesn't go the way that most kills in a crime movie go. Like there's kind of a back and forth nature to it, which is
Yeah.
what makes it creepy but not gratuitous, like we keep talking about. But in a way, it also makes it more frightening than what you'd see in any other gratuitous example that actually shows you all the blood and guts that could come from it. But weirdly, that back and forth, the fact that it's a strangulation that then does not become one, then becomes something else, and then it's like there's a prolonged nature to it that just makes it so like the hairs on the back of my neck stood up during that sequence. And I think it's also, I think even Kelly Jackal's performance in that moment, I think is kind of underappreciated for a movie.
Oh, it's
like
so
this.
good.
She has to really help set that tone, and I don't see her enough. Like I feel like I feel like she's an actress after the Pitch Perfect movies. I can't even name anything else that she's been in. But I think she's really good in just those opening moments, especially counterbalancing Daniel Zavato's really fearful performance as well.
Yeah, no, it's a striking moment that one immediately asserts us into the visual language of the film.
Yeah.
And that on its own took me aback. I was like, oh, Anna Kendrick is not messing around here. Like we're getting into this immediately in terms of not just the visuals, but as you stated there, Brendan, the tone of this film and what we're about to get into. And yes, we know that this is based off a serial killer, but I do think you have to establish, especially where this film goes in the end, what he is capable of. And not just capable of, murder and rape, but specifically this guy was known for torture, essentially, and brutally beating his victims to the point where they become incapacitated, but they're not dead. Like he literally toyed with his food. It is sickening. And I think establishing that the way Anna Kendrick does through that visual language and through that tone management, I think it absolutely needed to be here to place us directly into the psyche of that character. So as the film goes, and we know that eventually he's going to end up on the dating game and that there is going to be a meeting between the two characters, it raises the tension immediately. And they have that moment at the bar, as we noted earlier. And while that specific moment between the bartender there and Cheryl is absolutely incredible for the moments we talked about, the verbal sparring going on there between Rodney and Cheryl is also quite alarming as well. And the performances there from Kendrick and Zavato is just absolutely incredible. It's fantastic stuff. And then you get to the parking lot scene afterwards, which is incredibly ominous. It is tense. It is very suspenseful. And the reason that is felt is because of how Kendrick builds to it. By having that opening scene at the beginning of this film and showcasing the other bursts of violence throughout the film that we do see. And how that intersects with the dating game throughout the film, kind of going back and forth. I will note immediately after watching this film, I wasn't sure how seamless that was. I did maybe find it a little disjointed at times, but
That's
honestly,
fair.
upon repeat, or not repeat, but upon contemplating on this film, like wrestling with it, I've really come to lessen my grip on those criticisms, because I do think the way she weaves the violence with everything that's happening at the dating game, it does seem as there is some sort of vision behind those storytelling choices that I I really do love. And I do appreciate that she's willing to go as far as she does in terms of demonstrating what he is capable of, because that moment in the parking lot and what we see with Amy, as we noted earlier, everything there at the gas station, again, it is incredibly unnerving in terms of what we see, and the tension there is palpable because of her, the way she builds this film.
Well, yeah, because
I think
what's
it's
on
really
the
great.
page,
Yeah.
what's on the page, that parking lot sequence specifically, what's on the page is not much different than what you get in another crime thriller in many ways. In fact, it's even interrupted by a very massive plot convenience in a way, and which maybe you can criticize in another film, but going back to the opening of the film and how Anna Kendrick decides to use as an opening as a tone setter, like we're talking about, she emphasizes another thing, and this is also in Daniel Zavoto's performance, and what makes this film so chilling without going physically gratuitous. And I'm trying to be careful with how I say this because there is a grossness to it, but clearly she is portraying Rod as someone that gets off on the way he preys on the fear of his women. Like
Oh,
the,
yeah.
the fetishistic quality of him is the thing that's emphasized the most, which is what gives the entire film such a chilling quality. It's why that parking lot scene is so frightening, even though on the page, like I said, it's not reinventing the wheel, but the tone underneath it, or really surrounding it, does feel different for a movie like this. And it is because of that, like I said, that fetishistic quality in Rod. And that's it makes you feel so unclean watching that, which is really the quality that this film needs to succeed. And I think she does it really well as a director.
Absolutely. I think the other fascinating thing that kind of builds on what you both are saying is that the kind of disjointed nature of the narrative, with all of the time jumps and the flipping back
Yeah.
and forth, and the opening with the violence and then jumping to the dating game. I think that really, really works because, in addition to kind of being a disorienting experience watching, which I'm very much a fan of, I think it also kind of contextualizes it in, there's kind of this quality of never ending. Like it's almost like an open loop in a way. Like it starts with violence and then it stops a little, but then it starts up again and then it stops a little and then it starts up again. And it just feels like this continuity of violence, in that he is forever dangerous. And
It's this
he's,
circular nature to it.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's
Exactly.
a,
Very
that's a
cyclical.
good point. That's a very good point. Didn't even think
Thank
about
you.
it that way.
And I love that as well, because as we noted earlier, the dating game is in a lot of ways the centerpiece of this film. If all we got was the opening scene of the film, and then so much of the rest of it was Cheryl on the dating game, and yes, she is confronted with misogyny in other areas, without the interruptions, you might forget what is really at stake, or how, or again, what he is capable of. And if we never saw anything else and you get to that parking lot moment, it might feel a lot more contrived and manufactured in that case. And or you just might not feel the tension as much. But interrupting the dating game the way she does to remind us that he is this monster, this is how he uses his charm. Let's not forget that. So when he goes on to the dating game and you see that charm in full effect, especially when he's up against two other individuals, one of them hilariously obtuse.
One of the funniest
Oh.
performances
No
of the
idea
year.
what's-
One Bachelor
That
number
poor
one.
guy.
Poor guy. Yeah, he
I want to
was.
give that guy a hug.
He was innocent. that
He
poor
was.
man just did not
Okay,
know
let me go
anything.
back and say he's the one man that's innocent in this movie.
He might be the one innocent man.
The
in all
one.
this. He just
Because he's
didn't
an
know
idiot.
anything.
That's why.
Yeah. The second contestant, obviously, smug a-hole. There's really no other way to articulate it. And, you know, it left this giant vacuum for him to, you know, display that charm. And he really leans into that in a way that was pretty easy for him to win. And that back and forth, especially with Cheryl and how she completely subverts the misogyny around the show, like what, you know, how they manipulate that to create these quote unquote funny jokes or how the show was structured. She completely reverts against that in incredible ways that I really love here as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Which again, why I think of the Hunger Games, because that I'm not even sure what her role is there, but that lady there that's helping Cheryl out reminded me a lot of Seneca from that first film. That's exactly how that played out.
Yeah.
Like, get ready to go
Seneca
into the
and
arena. Yeah, it was really hilarious. And I was just waiting for Anna Kendrick's costume to catch on fire. That was the only thing missing.
This almost does feel a lot like the Hunger Games Year One.
Yeah.
Kind of is, yeah.
Yeah, she's going into battle,
She's
and
going
Rodney,
into battle.
you know,
Exactly,
we keep talking about how he's weaponizing charm. He knows all the right things to say. He knows
does.
he's using proper, like, feministy language. He knows how to call the other two men out. Like, he's doing everything quote unquote right in order to look like a good guy here. So
Yeah.
it is very much a battle.
Which is what makes that
exactly.
sea of misogyny so effective here, because every man here
Yes.
has similar qualities, but Rodney's recognizing that. He knows
Yeah.
that exists. So it's
Yes.
as
Takes
if
full
to say,
advantage of it.
I know
And-
I'm worse than these people.
Yes.
I might be a terrible person, but I know I can get away with it with my charm because no one's going to notice it because everyone else is doing similar things. And that's
Right.
what
He's
makes,
exploiting that.
yeah, exactly.
Which he does at every turn, right? I mean, with Amy, he approaches her with the camera. You're really beautiful. And like everything he says to her hits the right note, even when she pushes back as far as being this runaway or however she articulates her identity there. But he has a really charming comeback that makes her feel wanted. And again, you go back to the New York scene, or the New York City scene, excuse me, and how, again, with, I believe the character's name is Charlie in that sequence, he simply lends a hand. You need help moving everything into your apartment. And he just, it's on its face, it's a kind gesture
Right.
that he then totally exploits. So he is very aware of how like broad misogyny might keep these women at a distance. He just knows how to break through that tension with that charm. And it is quite disturbing to see how Anna Kendrick as a filmmaker exploits that herself.
Yeah.
I also think the absolute arrogance of Rodney as a real life person and as a character to think, I'm a serial killer and I'm going to go on national television and it's going to be
know.
totally fine because no
Crazy.
one's looking for me. The cops don't care. They're not going to find me. And I'm just going to fool all these women. Like the utter
well, I think
arrogance is mind blowing.
It's also the most, perhaps the scariest quality of him too, is that his actions, from his point of view, he sees as a form of normalcy. Like that's, and that's probably what gives him that sense that, okay, I can go on a dating show. I'm just a normal guy that maybe want to meet a girl.
Yeah.
This is normal, right? This is normal.
Well, and I think the normalcy in terms of the culture, the widespread misogyny that we see, which is why I think it's important that Anna Kendrick leans into that as a filmmaker, because there was a level of normalcy to it. And also it taps into the apathy in terms of law enforcement and them taking this seriously, because the irony that he was allowed to be on the dating game and then to win that show, it is an incredible irony. But you also have to think about the timetable here, because the Charlie scene in New York City, in which he eventually murders her, that is 1971. When he goes on the dating game, it is 1978. 1978. So he murders a woman in the early 70s. Nearly a decade goes on. And to your point, Megan, he just is completely like, it's fine. I'm good. And just has the arrogance to go on the show and act like nothing's going to happen to him.
all
And
set.
honestly, if not for Amy, he might have gotten away with it anyway.
Right?
Crazy. Like, that's absolutely insane. Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad I didn't grow up in that era.
Yeah. I mean, I just, it is a wild era. The 70s were
Great music, amazing
unique.
music. Yeah.
Great movies, great films. It was great for the art scene. I don't know about
was.
anything
Yes.
else though.
Yeah.
Everything
Wasn't
else
great for
terrible.
human beings, though.
No.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Oh my gosh. All right. Well, any final thoughts we have here on Women of the Hour?
I will say, just going back to something, because in my opening thoughts, I did reference how I was still scratching my head a little bit on the film's non-linear structure. But Megan, once again, I want to really give you credit for a really interesting point you made on the circular nature that
you.
it's certainly going for. On it, and it is making me like the movie more, because that was maybe my one. I don't even want to call it a reservation. It was just an uncertainty I had about the film, because it does have such a unusual and unique structure to it. But the more I thought about it, if the film had told this story in any other way, that may have added an unwanted conventionality to it. I'm glad the film doesn't have that. It does kind of have this weird flow and emphasizes certain things in a different way that I think a more conventional narrative may have hindered that. So I'm coming around even more on that, and honestly liking the film more as we talk about it. We haven't really talked much about the like what's real and what's fabricated here. I don't really care all that much, because the movie works as it needs to, and whatever liberties that Anna Kendrick takes as far as deviating away from history, I think are the right ones. Because I know in real life, I think Cheryl maybe wasn't really an actress or something like that. I think I heard that was maybe the case. There's not really much of a record of that, or even what Bachelor #2 actually does to whisper to her, be careful of this man. Like, there are little things like that from what I've understand in the small research I've done may not have actually happened, or there's at least no record of that. But I don't care. This is not a documentary. This is not a historical blueprint.
Exactly.
It's the same reason we give a pass to someone like M. Night Shyamalan for bending his own rules just to get to the points that he wants to make. Who cares what the rules are? Film is a visual medium, and Anna Kendrick recognizes that to get to the points that she needs to make.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think those are all great points, and I agree. This is not a documentary. Take all the liberties you want, as long as you're telling a compelling story. I could not agree more. The last thing I will say is that watching this, I thought a lot about two other films, and I think they'd make kind of a fascinating, double or triple feature. I thought about Kitty Green's brilliant film, The Assistant, which is so subtle and so scathing in another depiction of sexism and misogyny and how a woman navigates that. And I love that film so much. And I also thought a lot about, I know a film you're either have talked about or going to be talking about for the show, Red Rooms, Pascal Plant's chilling film about the true crime genre, which is a very different take on it. And
You're already stealing my thunder on what I keep making your point. Keep making your point. I think this is great. This is honestly why we're going to release this review first, and it's going to be a nice precursor to our review of Red Rooms coming later.
Yeah, I was like, I saw your tweet about how these were coming, and I was like, that is like a perfect double feature, because I kept thinking about Red Rooms while watching this, and just how terrifying that film is in a really unique way as well, and how it explores voyeurism and exploitation and true crime. And I don't want to say more, because I want to hear your conversation, but I think that a lot of those themes and the way it's going about violence, and again, a woman at the center who is participating in being a bystander and watching all of this unfold, it's very fascinating. And I think all three films are looking at how women navigate the space and how they deal with violence, either overtly or covertly, in really captivating ways. So that's what this film made me think of. And I agree with you, Brendan, that I think the more I liked this right away, but I think the more I've thought about this film and the more I've kind of sat with it, the more I've liked it, and the more I've kind of appreciated the small touches that this film does so well.
Yeah, I am the same way. I immediately loved the film, had a few reservations, as I noted earlier, but the more I sat on it, the more I have come to appreciate it more. And even this conversation, I think, has endeared the film even further for me. I'm
Mm-hmm.
starting to really love the film a lot. And I guess as a final thought here, one thing that comes to mind for me, and I'm not exactly sure how to articulate this further, but there is something here as far as the nucleus of the film
Mm-hmm.
around this idea of feeling seen and why that is
Mm-hmm.
important.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we've certainly discussed that a little bit in this conversation through
Mhm.
the various filmmaking techniques that Anna Kendrick employs and the misogyny and how these characters have to respond to it, as you were just alluding to there, Megan. But I think of a couple of moments here. Earlier, we noted that quite tense date sequence near the end of the film between Rodney
Mhm.
and Cheryl. And in that conversation, Cheryl at one point is asked why she went on the show. And she says, my agent said it would get me seen. And
Yeah.
honestly, now that I'm thinking about it and even talking about it here, I think to your point, Brennan, as far as details that are changed, this is why. This
Yeah.
is why she makes those changes.
Yeah.
Because as an actress, a struggling actress, she takes whatever gig she can. So
Mhm.
she is on television, right? She has
Yeah.
a job. Maybe someone watching, a producer perhaps, will see her and it'll lead to more gigs. So she tells Rodney, my agent said it would get me seen. And he replies back to her, did you feel seen? And she simply says, I felt looked at, which I thought was a
Yes.
pretty revealing answer there from Cheryl.
Mhm.
And he goes on to say, Rodney goes on to say, you know, most people don't like to be seen. They're afraid because you have to be comfortable with yourself. You have to stop performing, which I think is equally an alarming response, because that tethers immensely to what we were saying earlier in terms of how these women have to perform. They have
Yeah.
to perform to survive.
Yes.
It's not even that they have a choice to be comfortable with themselves. They have to perform. So this idea of feeling seen, it feels distant in a lot of ways, which then circles to a notion we said earlier in terms of how there's this communication between the women, this nonverbal communication, where I don't know if I'm going to be seen in a broader sense, but I might be able to be seen from others who understand what it's like to feel distant, to feel
Yes.
isolated
Yeah.
and vulnerable. And we brought up some great moments earlier in the film. Another one I can think of here off the cuff is not with Cheryl, but with Amy, right? So this is after she performs, right? She
Mhm.
laughs off being raped and beaten, which again, striking,
Yeah.
that whole sequence there. But she's in Rodney's car. They're going to the gas station, but before they get there, they're at a stop sign. And the camera focuses again on the eyes of Amy, who looks at the driver in this other truck across from them. And she locks eyes with him, trying to attempt this communication, but it is a man behind the wheel. He has absolutely no clue, or again, it could be misogynistic. It could be apathy, going back to that here as well.
There's
Either
so
way,
many
he
layers
drives
in
off.
just that one
So many
lack
layers,
of
yeah.
exchange. Yeah,
So,
because on one
again-
hand, you can look at it in that way, JD, but you can also look at it as Amy thinking, wait, if I run now, this will just give away my cover too early. And it
Exactly,
might not
yes.
work. So there's even
Right.
more of a practical nature to
Yeah.
it as well.
Absolutely. There is 100% a practical, logistical
Yeah.
angle to that.
Yeah.
As far
But
as
that
a
added layer,
storytelling
that added layer of
tension.
yours is, I
Yes.
think, is more fascinating though.
But I am looking underneath in terms of, again, the importance of being seen. And that was one of the more crucial moments for her as far as trying to convey, like trying to be seen, because she is desperate. She's absolutely desperate trying to get out of this. And I just find that to be such an incredible,
Yeah.
nuanced filmmaking choice there. that is
Agreed.
in some ways contradictory to all the moments that we said earlier with Cheryl, because she's locking eyes with these other women, and here's a moment with Amy where it's with someone else and there's a clear gap. And I think it just kind of gives that other side of the coin to, when it comes to the importance of being seen, there's this polarity there that I think Anna Kendrick is trying to tap into, as it relates to this idea of being seen, that I think is really great. So I don't know. I kind of stumbled through that, but as we were talking,
you did good. You did
that
fine.
was great.
Okay, appreciate it.
Yeah, I was also going to say, it kind of also, in addition, reminded me of how Cheryl is, when she quote stops performing, is when she's having the most joy on the show, when she's being herself, and she's and she's bantering, and she's talking about Einstein and Kant and all of these philosophers and things, so that is kind of fascinating. But you're
Very
right,
funny sequence too.
so funny, so good. But I'm so glad you actually said that, JD, because I had been thinking about the kind of notion of being seen and looked at. I really kind of focused on that angle, where there's such a difference between being looked at as an object and being seen, where it's like on your terms and your agency. But you're absolutely right. It does tie into that visual language that Anna Kendrick has had going throughout the whole film about, this connection with other women and signaling if you're in danger or if you're safe. And I think all of that is just, there's such a much larger conversation happening in the film that I just think is brilliant. So I love that you mentioned it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Well said. I completely agree. Yeah. I love that. And this conversation, I think, has helped me unpack that even further here than I had already wrestled with previously. So
good movie.
Honestly, this is, I think, ended up being one of my favorite conversations we've done all year.
That's so cool.
Oh, this is
look at our timestamp.
Really
it's almost exactly an hour. We did have the woman of the hour on this show.
There you go. Woman of the exact hour, almost.
That'll be the hashtag for it right there. Woman of the exact hour.
Yeah, there you go. The last thing I'll just quickly note, I will echo you guys on the performances here. Daniel Savato is chilling in this performance. Anna Kendrick is fantastic. Really, really great to see her on camera. And her performances are always really good. I always enjoy watching her as a performer, but to me, this is Anna Kendrick, the director, really shining through. Like, this is Anna Kendrick, the director, that is the star of this film in many regards. And I was pretty stunned by it.
Yeah.
With all of that said, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say, if you're watching on YouTube, please leave a comment below. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. You can always email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com as well. Megan, thanks for being here. This was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a fun conversation about and that feels weird to say about such an intense topic in film, but it was a delightful conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
No, of course. We always love having you here. Tell us where we can find your work online. Where can we follow you on social media?
You can find me at Spoilerpiece Theater. It's a weekly podcast that I co-host. I also co-host the Slashers podcast, which is a limited horror podcast. You can find my written reviews at Edge Media Network. And you can follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Opinioness World, and Instagram and Letterboxd at The Opinioness.
Yes, please go and check out Megan's work. Check out her podcast. It's fantastic. Always a pleasure having you here, Megan. And I noted earlier, you've been here a couple of times. You've been on Women in Session. I also, it would be amiss if I didn't mention that Megan has also written for us at InSessionFilm.com.
I have.
Good
Megan
point.
had an incredible,
Bringing it full circle. I love it.
incredible piece about It Ends With Us, a film I admittedly still haven't seen. I need to get around to it. But your piece was very moving around that film.
Thank you.
Very
Thank you so
personal
much.
to her. Please go and check it out if you haven't. It is currently, the link to it is actually pinned at the top of Megan's Twitter. So follow her and you'll see it.
That's your excuse.
So that's
Yes.
a great excuse. So please go and check that out. It was fantastic. So yeah, thanks for being here, Megan. Really do appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Thanks a lot.
As we noted at the end of that review, we have another review coming soon as well. We are going to be talking about Red Rooms. I very much look forward to getting into that. So be sure to stay tuned. The main show for this week, which we haven't recorded yet, but that will be on the way as well. We are going to be talking about our top 5. Is that what we decided on? Top 5?
I think so, yeah.
True crime movies?
Yeah, top 5 true crime movies. Thrillers, whatever they might be as far as a genre standpoint. But I think given the Woman of the Hour and the Red Rooms kind of collection, if you will, I feel like focusing on that aspect made the most sense.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. So we'll be talking about true crime movies, and spoiler alert, I think Woman of the Hour, based off of this conversation in Red Rooms, that just might be my 1 and 2 respectively. So,
you're going to get a lot of people coming after you saying, where the heck is Dog Day Afternoon?
I know. Look, we're doing a top 5. There's 3 more spots available. So,
okay.
We'll get into it.
Be in there. Yeah, I'll allow it.
At any rate, all joking aside, stay tuned for that. We'll have a new Chasing the Gold and Women in Session this week as well. So a lot going on, as always. With that, we'll go ahead and wind down. Thanks again, Megan, for being here. Really do appreciate you. Thanks for listening, watching, everybody. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast.